In comp number 4, Priority Multi-Mesh, we see that the layer is actually a pre-comp. Inside the pre-comp, we have 3 different images, and each one of these images has its own transparency value. When we use a puppet pin on an image like this, the puppet pin is going to create an auto trace for the pixels immediately under it. It's easier to understand when you see this in action. We'll select the puppet pin tool, then click on any one of these. Let's start with the one on the far left. Once we click on this, we set a pin and create a mesh. We can't see the mesh because the options for our mesh are turned off. But if we turn this on in the options for our tool, we can see the mesh created just for that one octopus on the end. We'll change the expansion value down to about 2. With only one pin in the mesh, rather than deforming the mesh, this pin is going to move the mesh around. Next, we can create a second mesh for the middle octopus. By clicking on this octopus, we create a new mesh. You can see in the timeline that a new mesh has been created. Inside each one of these mesh shapes are the options for the mesh and all of the pins that are associated with the mesh. We'll create one more mesh by clicking on the third octopus. On the third octopus, we'll also create some pins on the lower part of his legs. We'll close up all 3 of these meshes so that we can see them, and we'll rename them with the names of the octopus in order of their original position. So this one would be first. This one will be second. And the last one will be third. If we move these puppet pins, we're moving the mesh. As we've seen in the previous lesson, we can move parts of one mesh over itself. With multiple meshes, the priority of the mesh in the timeline is very important. Here, we'll zoom into these 3 octopus to see what they look like. We have the first mesh selected. However, if we take a look at it, the first mesh is at the bottom below the second and third mesh that we've created. However, it appears on top in our composition. If we move the third mesh down below the first mesh, we can see that now this appears on the top. This is almost like a reverse order, with the bottommost mesh taking priority over the other meshes in this layer. We still have the ability to move the pins on individual layers. And the pins don't affect one mesh to the other, even though all of these meshes are connected to the same layer in our timeline. Now in the center, we have our first mesh below the third mesh here on the right-hand side. Once we select the Puppet Overlap tool, we'll be able to apply a Puppet Overlap pin. However, it appears that we can't apply it to the first mesh here in the comp window. That's because the Puppet Overlap pin has to be applied to the shape of the original mesh. Remember, this is the octopus which first appeared on the left-hand side of the screen. We'll have to zoom out in order to see where his mesh actually lives. We need to apply these pins to the original mesh shape. With the mesh shape selected, I'll click once, then increase the extent so that it encompasses all of the triangulation in my layer. If I move this in front to a positive value of 100 or even greater, you can see that this mesh will never cross in front of the mesh above it. The Puppet Overlap pin only applies to the triangulation within that mesh. It doesn't apply from mesh to mesh. While we've started with 3 images in our layer, we may want to produce more of them. So we'll go back to our Puppet Pin tool, and with the Puppet Pin tool selected, as we hover over the areas where the mesh was first created, we get a yellow line describing the outline of that first mesh. What's interesting now is that if I create a puppet pin here, I'll duplicate the mesh and all of the pixels that created that original mesh shape. I'll click once, and now you can see, miraculously, another octopus has appeared. We started with 3, but once we click in that silhouette, another one appears. What's happening is that the Puppet tool is duplicating all of those pixels by creating another mesh shape here in the timeline. I'll click on the newly created mesh in the timeline and rename this Ghost 1. I can move this mesh away from its original position, and again, hover over the area where the original mesh was created. I'll click once more, and then move this away. We'll name him Ghost 2. We can continue doing this until we're tired or have enough duplicates to fill the screen. Now, we could have started with just one, then duplicated him over and over, but it's important to note that you can start with either a multiple of images or a single image and create multiples with each image having its own mesh shape and each mesh having its own set of deformation pins and its own set of overlap pins and its own set of starch pins as well. And each mesh is going to have a priority in this layer based on its position in the timeline.